A good vach, my holy sisters and brothers. Let me pause that. Shavua Tov, a good week to you. Here we are. It's late on a Saturday night, early in the new week. Let's light up the darkness. That was Keepa Live doing their version of Havdalah. Really beautiful version. I just love it. Who is with us as we get it going? A new week with some beautiful learning on a Saturday night. It's going to be a quick show. We're going to do the whole DAF, and it's still going to be a short show because this was an extraordinarily short page. Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey. Paula in Chicago. Lindsay in Cincy. Christo in Lubbock. Paula is with us from the Great Northwest. Bill in Berkeley. Christo really likes this version of the Havdalah. Stephen in Oklahoma. Ryan in Jacksonville. Rochelle in Modesto. Nachum Budalovsky in the Holy Land. Welcome, Nachum. Gwen found an answer to a question that she asked a month ago. Very good. Thank you for sharing that. Tom saying Shavua Tov. Maria in Hebron, Kentucky. And over there on the YouTube side, Seraphim is with us from Sacramento. Welcome, everybody. A very quick story I'll share that I heard today from Rav Yakusiel in Armenian. It's, so much in this world is based on your state of mind, particularly if you can achieve that attitude of gratitude. So there's a famous Chabad mashpia, a rabbi and businessman whose name was Menachem Mendel Futterfass. Now, he lived in the early part of the 20th century, and he had been a successful business. Well, I'm not even going to say that part. He was sentenced to Siberia, right? So, Stalin stuck him in Siberia in the old Soviet Union because he was sharing the teachings of Judaism in Soviet Russia. Thank God we don't live in such a society now. Doing what I'm doing here could have, with you and me both could have ended up in Siberia because we're sharing Torah in a public forum. At any rate, he ended up in Siberia. And it was a horrible place, as you can imagine. They didn't even spend the money to imprison you properly. It's like, go there and fend for yourself. There were some prison guards who still made it difficult to have any kind of Judaism, but they had to build their own dwellings and live in the frigid cold. It was a horrible place. The only thing that was interesting about it was that when you go to prison, okay, so this is a rabbi, a beautiful teacher of Torah. He could end up in a prison cell, with murderers and thieves and forgers and who knows, all kinds of horrible criminals. He ended up in Siberia, and who were his companions? I mean, one was the dean of a law school, another one was a professor of medicine, the other was head of pediatrics in a hospital. There was basically a big financier, what we would call today a hedge fund manager. People who had been incredibly successful earlier in their lives and ended up running afoul of the Soviet communist authorities and ended up in Siberia. Well, they were really lamenting one day, before I came here, I had a staff of 100. I had people who answered me. I rode around in a beautiful carriage. Another one, are you kidding? I had a staff of 200. I had a beautiful mansion with 30 rooms, and now I'm living in this misery. And they're all just complaining about how miserable their lives have become. And it basically gets to Rabbi Futterfuss that it's your turn to whine about how awful it is here. And he just smiled. And they said, well, Futterfuss, he must have been a poor man before, and Siberia's really no worse for him than it was. He was a lowlife then, he's a lowlife now, as we all are. And Futterfuss said, no, actually, I was a very successful businessman. I had 3 businesses with, dozens and dozens or maybe hundreds of employees. Very, very successful. However, when I was rich and had all the trappings of wealth, I really considered that my primary identity was a servant of God. I was a servant of Hashem then, and I'm a servant of Hashem now. God appointed me in this world to fulfill my mission, and for whatever reason, God has now placed me in Siberia, and this is the part of my life's journey where I'm meant to fulfill a mission is here in Siberia. So I'm just looking around to see what it is that I'm supposed to do here as a servant of God. And it gives me joy to be a servant of God now as it did then. So they can imprison your body, they can't imprison your mind. And if you are a servant of Hashem, well then wherever you are, you have an opportunity to fulfill your mission in this world. A story worth remembering. We are on DAF Mem Ches, page 48 here in Tractate Yoma, the laws of Yom Kippur. This is the 6th volume of the Talmud. We are in chapter 5, continuing our discussion of the first Mishna of chapter 5. We've been talking about the incense service of Yom Kippur. So the high priest is going to take a handful or 2 handfuls of the incense. And we talked about this yesterday, that when he's going to take these 2 handfuls of incense into the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur and drop them on the hot coals, which he has brought in the special gold coal pan that is used for this purpose. And then this cloud of beautiful smelling aromatic incense will fill the Holy of Holies. Now the Torah says he has to take 2 handfuls, but we learned yesterday if he's actually got his hands filled with the superfine ground incense, well then he can't carry the coal pan. So what they did is they constructed a special spoon or ladle which held the same volume as his 2 hands full, and he would actually scoop the incense with his hands but then place it into that special ladle, which is the same size as his handfuls. But now he can carry the ladle in one hand of incense and the coals in the other. And because the coals are hot and heavy, he would actually carry the coal pan in his right hand and the ladle with the special incense in his left hand. Apropos this law and this teaching and this practice that the high priest would do on Yom Kippur, Rav Pappa, who we've encountered many times in our journey through the Talmud, is going to ask, or started asking on yesterday's page, although we didn't cover it, a series of questions about, okay, well, exactly how does he do this and what does it mean? And if he does it a little bit one way instead of another, is the service still going to be valid? That's where we pick it up. And today we're going to do the whole daf because it's a short daf. It's a bit of a technical daf, so let's just see if we can make it as clear as possible and follow the logic. Rav Pappa asked, what is the law in the case where he stuck the handful of flour on the side of the vessel? Now, why is he talking about flour? Yesterday we started talking about the incense, but because this idea of measuring by handful of the incense, the sages will also mention that there's another place in the Torah where a priest measures handfuls of a powder, namely the meal offering that's brought every day. So there's an offering that's brought in the temple using flour, finely ground flour. And it also has to be taken with the hands. In that case, it's not going to be transferred to a ladle and then later poured on coals. It's a meal offering. Flour. It's flour that's going to be offered on the main altar, the outer altar in the courtyard where offerings are burned. Usually we think about parts of animals being burned on the altar, but also flour is sometimes, wheat flour is just thrown onto that fire. So apropos that service, which also has to be measured in a certain way, and we learn that a handful of flour is actually taken with these 3 fingers, and the thumb and the pinky are used to sort of scrape off the excess. On yesterday's page, they actually discussed that it would be better to have a fat high priest, or a fat priest, doesn't have to be a high priest, who has fat fingers so that flour wouldn't get caught in the spaces between his fingers. At any rate, they were asking some questions about what happens with the flour that kind of squeezes through the fingers. So we're still talking now about using handfuls for the flour offering. So Rav Pappa asks, what is the law in the case where he stuck the handful of flour onto the side of the vessel? After the flour of a meal offering has been separated, it must be placed in a vessel for burning. So it's not going to go directly from wherever he collects the flour to the fire. It first is going to get placed in a vessel, some kind of a vessel that's going to be used for bringing it. So after the flour, the meal offering has been separated, it's placed in a vessel for burning, an action that sanctifies the flour, right? Because this is one of the sacred vessels of the Holy Temple. So it's just flour until it gets placed in that vessel. Even when the priest picks it up, at that point, he's just measuring it. But when it goes in that vessel, now it is sanctified. It is set apart just for this purpose. And Rav Pappa inquires as to what the halacha, what the law is, if the priest places the flour on the sides of the vessel instead of underneath the vessel or inside the vessel. Oh, I'm sorry. I guess instead of inside the vessel, he puts it on the side of the vessel. Maybe it's a little bit moist and he's able to just stick it there. And the Gemara clarifies the 2 sides of the dilemma. Do we require that the handful be inside the vessel, the proper way? And that is the case here. Or perhaps we require that the handful be placed properly inside the vessel, and that is not required. Okay, so it's going inside the vessel but stuck to the side, and that's not the normal way to put some flour inside a vessel. It should be on the bottom of this container. Instead, he stuck it to the side. Rav Pappa is asking, well, he's done it now in kind of abnormal, less than ideal way. Is this going to disqualify the service? And the answer is, taiku, let it stand. They weren't able to give an answer to this question. The Gemara continues. Mar bar Rav Ashi, Mar the son of Rav Ashi, raised a similar dilemma. What is the law if the priest overturned the vessel and stuck the handful to the underside? In other words, he turned the vessel over, and now he took this handful of flour and used the bottom is now the top, and he just put it on top of that. He's still using the vessel to transport the flour up to the altar, but not in the normal way, not inside this cup, but rather turning the cup over and putting the flour on its bottom. Do we require the handful to be inside the vessel? And that requirement is fulfilled here as the handful is between the sides of the vessel. Or perhaps we require it to be placed properly inside the vessel, and that is not the case here. And with regard to this question as well, the Gemara states, teku, let it stand. Rav Pappa raised a dilemma. Should the handfuls to which the sages referred be smoothed over or slightly overflowing? And Rabbi Abba said to Rav Ashi, come in here an explicit statement in the Baraisa. The handfuls to which the sages referred should be neither smoothed over nor overflowing, but full, without any flour spilling out. We learned in a Mishna there in Zevachim 32a. If the blood of the sacrificial animal spilled on the floor instead of being collected directly into a vessel, and a priest collected it from there into a vessel, it is disqualified as it was not collected properly. And conversely, if the blood spilled from the vessel onto the floor after it was collected properly, and a priest collected it and put it back in the vessel, it is valid. So now we've been talking about, incense, then we started talking about flour. Now we're talking about an animal offering. For animal offerings, when they're brought to make an atonement, what makes the atonement is that the animal is slaughtered in the temple courtyard. That means that a sharp knife makes a cut in the neck of the animal. When the blood spills out, the first flow of blood, which after it goes out, the animal dies, that's called the life blood, or the blood of the soul of the animal. It's that blood that has to be collected in a vessel and then brought up to the altar to continue the service. It has to be collected in a vessel. That's part of the law. So here, the dilemma that's being asked, and then they're going to relate it back to the flour and to the incense, is what happens if it spills out on the floor, so you can identify that's the life blood. I didn't catch it in the vessel, it got on the floor, but if I scoop it up and then put it in the vessel, does it still count? And the Baraisa says the priest collected it from the floor into the vessel, disqualified. But if he caught it in the vessel when it came out of the animal, and then some of it spilled on the floor, and he picked that up and put it back in the vessel, then that's not ideal. You shouldn't do that, of course, but the service would not be disqualified because the essential act of sanctifying that blood by catching it in the sacred vessel was completed properly. And the Gemara asks, from where are these matters derived? As the sages taught in a midrash on the law, and the anointed priest shall take from the blood of the bull, that's Leviticus 4:5, and this means that the priest shall take from the blood of the soul, the life blood, i.e. the bull's blood that flows from the place of slaughter as the animal dies, and not from the blood of the skin, which bleeds out when the skin is cut before the slaughter, nor from the blood squeezed from an animal after the initial spurt. There's other blood involved. When the skin is first cut, some blood comes out. That's not the life blood. After the animal has died, more blood still comes out. But that's not the life blood, so that can't be used. And the Baraisa interprets from the blood of the bull as though these words were written in a different order. The blood from the bull, i.e. the priest shall receive it directly from the blood of the bull, or blood from the bull. So in Hebrew, that's a prefix, the letter mem as a prefix from, and you could put it, is the mem in front of the blood or in front of the bull? It's written in the Torah from the blood of the bull. Why would they think to move the prefix and interpret it as blood from the bull, i.e. that the priest shall receive it directly from the bull and not pick it up after it's spilled on the floor? For if it should enter your mind that the letter mem, which means from, in the phrase from the blood of the bull, is limiting, and it indicates that even if the priest received some of the blood, his action is acceptable, didn't Rav Yehuda say, he who receives the blood must receive all of the blood, all of the life blood of the bull, as it is stated, and all the blood of the bull he shall pour out on the base of the altar. Once he's received it in that vessel, it's going to be conveyed to the altar, and then it's going to be poured out in a ceremony. And this verse emphasizes that the priest must pour all of the bull's life blood, which is possible only if he has collected all of it. Rather, learn from this that what is the meaning of the phrase from the blood of the bull? It means that the priest must receive the blood directly from the bull. And this sage maintains that the sages subtract and add and interpret homiletically, i.e. that one may take a letter from one word, insert it into a second word, and explain the phrase in that manner. Now, when the sages engage in this kind of homiletic grammatical exercise, they're not doing it willy-nilly. It's not like you can say, well, I want to rewrite the Bible, and I could just take a letter from the first part of the phrase and put it in the second part of the phrase and change a yes into a no, a permitted into a prohibited, etc. They had very specific criteria which would enable them to do that in only very specific situations by well-established tradition. If you want to learn more about that, look at the footnote on how this particular thing is derived on page 48 on the A side of Tractate Yoma. We're going to continue. Rav Pappa raised a dilemma based on the above ruling. Now, what is the law if the incense from his handfuls is scattered? That's why this whole question of the bull's blood was brought up. So what if the incense that the high priest is going to bring into the Holy of Holies, so he scooped it out properly, he got the handfuls, and then I guess it's going to be a question either before it goes into the ladle or once it's in the ladle, and it becomes scattered. Can it be regathered up and put back, either back into his hand and then in the ladle, or if it was already in the ladle, it gets scattered, put it back in the ladle? Has the service become disqualified and we need to start over? Or it was just, okay, some spilled out and we're going to put it back in. That's what Rav Pappa is asking. So, is his hand considered like the neck of the animal and the incense is disqualified? Okay, so it was in his hand and then it became scattered. So it didn't make it into the ladle. That's the situation that we're talking about. If the blood of the animal spilled out before it was captured in the vessel, so then this would be a disqualified ceremony. So Rav Pappa is saying, is it the same with the incense of Yom Kippur? After he scoops it in his hand, if it falls out, can it be picked up and put back into the ladle and put into the ladle? Or perhaps his hand is his hand like the neck of the animal and the incense is disqualified? Or perhaps his hand is considered like a vessel used in the temple service, and if the incense fell from his hand, it is not disqualified. No answer was found for this question either, and the Gemara concludes, Teku. That question was not answered. Rav Pappa raised another dilemma. What is the halacha, what is the law, if the high priest thought a disqualifying thought during the taking of the handful of incense? For example, if he intended to burn it after its appropriate time. Now, we've seen elsewhere that there's these two concepts that are related, nosar and pigul. So for most offerings, we're not talking about the burnt offering, but offerings that have an eating component, right? So either a peace offering or the Passover offering, or a sin offering, which is not eaten by the person bringing the offering, but some of it is eaten by the priests. If there's a time limit of the part that's going to be eaten, it has to be eaten by a deadline, and if you eat it after the deadline, it disqualifies the offering. That's nasar. If at the time you're slaughtering it, you have an intention, well, I'm going to eat it, but I don't want to eat it tonight, I'm going to eat it tomorrow, and if for that particular offering it has to be eaten tonight, like the Passover offering, then the fact that you were thinking at the time that it was being slaughtered that you would eat it after its deadline would actually disqualify it from the outset. That's where the intention, not the action, but the intention of the priest during the slaughter can actually disqualify the offering. So Rav Pappa is asking, does this concept of pigul, of having an intention to use it after its time has passed, disqualify it at the outset? Does that apply to the incense of Yom Kippur? So that's the question. So does this thought invalidate the ritual or not? Do we say that this law is derived by means of a verbal analogy of handfuls and handfuls from the case of the meal offering, the flour offering brought on a daily basis? Just as there, with regard to the meal offering, thought is effective to invalidate it. A meal offering is like an animal offering if the priest who's bringing it to the altar, or is going to take out the handful, put it in the sacred vessel, and then bring it to the altar, if at the time that he's doing that he's scooping it out and putting it in the vessel, he's thinking, well, actually, I'll do this tomorrow, so he has already invalidated it, that applies to the wheat flour offering. Does that same idea apply to the incense? Because both of these laws have the concept of the priest takes a handful. So maybe because handful is included in both laws, we should apply this same idea that you can disqualify it by having an intention at the outset to use it at the wrong time or beyond its deadline. That's the question. So just as there, with regard to the meal offering, thought his intention is effective to invalidate it, so too here, with regard to taking a handful of incense, thought is an improper thought effective to invalidate the offering, or perhaps the two cases should not be compared. Rav Shimi bar Ashi said to Rav Pappa, "Come and hear a resolution to your dilemma." Rabbi Akiva added the handful of fine flour and the incense and the frankincense and the coals that are collected in a vessel to the ruling of the sages that if one immersed himself during the day, touched part of them, he disqualifies all of them. Okay, so what this is about is the idea a tevel yom is a person who was tameh or is tameh. He became ritually impure. Let's say that he touched a dead creeping thing that made him tameh. Now he is not qualified. If he's a priest, he's not qualified to serve in the temple until he has completed his purification, and he is tahor again. So part of that purification process is immersing in the mikveh, in the ritual bath. Once he's done that, he's called a tevel yom. He has done everything that he needs to do, but he's still not considered tahor, ritually pure, until night arrives. And the day in which his purification happened, when he immersed in the mikveh, he has to wait until that day ends. And then that night, he becomes qualified again to serve in the temple. So even though he's done all the technical things that he needs to do to purify himself, he still has to wait for nightfall. So if before nightfall, when he's still in a state of impurity, he touches offerings in the temple, he will disqualify them. And Rabbi Akiva said that not only will he disqualify the ritual if he touches the offering itself, but even if he touches the accessories of the offering, right? He added a handful of fine flour and the incense, right, which are different, a little bit different than the animal offerings. But Rabbi Akiva says, yes, he will disqualify incense. He will disqualify the meal offering. He will disqualify the frankincense, which is brought along with the showbreads on the table in the sanctuary, and even the coals that are collected in a vessel, right? Coals don't become impure, right? Impurity pertains to people and to food and to vessels that hold those things. Coal is not normally something that would become impure, but because it is used in the temple ceremonies, right? The incense has to be put on those coals. If he touches those coals, or I guess the coal pan, while he's in a state of impurity, it's going to disqualify that whole service. Now, due to the respect, and this is explained, due to the respect with which sacred objects are held, these objects are treated as one solid unit. And this is so despite the fact that its parts are not really attached to each other, but are separate, small segments, and therefore, logically, one who immersed himself during the day should disqualify only those parts of the item with which he came into direct contact. Right? Let's say he didn't touch the incense, he only touched the coal pan. Well, the coal pan hasn't touched the incense. Why does it disqualify the whole ceremony? Maybe they could just bring a different coal pan and continue. But no, it disqualifies the whole thing. That was a ruling of Rabbi Akiva. And the Gemara explained, if it enters your mind that from the fact that one who immersed himself during the day disqualifies these items by touch, and therefore leaving them after the permitted time, this idea of nosar, of pigul, likewise disqualifies them, and from the fact that leaving them after their time disqualifies them, therefore thought likewise disqualifies them. Consequently, all right, so leaving them after their time is nasar, intending to leave them after their time is pigul, and all of these can disqualify. So consequently, as incense is similar to flour with regard to ritual impurity, it is also disqualified by the priest's improper thought. That's it. Rav Pappa raised another dilemma. And now we're on the B side of page 48, and it's like a tiny little paragraph, so we're almost done. What is the law if he thought invalidating thoughts during the raking of the coals? Does this thought invalidate the incense? And the Gemara elaborates. The question here is whether actions that facilitate the performance of the mitzvah are considered like the mitzvah itself. So now we're not even talking about that a person who's impure touches the coals and the coal pan that the incense is going to go on, or the coals that are on the incense altar that the incense is going to go on, but rather just like another action that doesn't directly touch upon the ritual of bringing the incense or bringing the meal offering, etc., but just raking the coals so that like when you rake a fireplace to like get it heated up, and you just move the powder off of the coals to expose the burning coals, and you haven't even really touched the coals, you just touched it with a rake that was for the purpose of exposing the burning coals. If an impure person did that, is he going to disqualify the whole ceremony? So in other words, are actions that facilitate the performance of a mitzvah considered like the mitzvah itself? If so, merely raking the coals, which facilitates the mitzvah of the incense, is like burning the incense itself. Therefore, an improper thought would disqualify the incense. Or perhaps actions that facilitate the performance of a mitzvah are not considered part of the mitzvah itself. And no answer was found for this question either. And the Gemara once again concludes, Teku, let it stand. Right? It seems like we're pretty far removed from what should be a disqualifying thing, that the priest at the time that he's raking the coals, because he's in an impure state, is going to disqualify the whole incense service, and somebody else is going to have to come and start over because he was not qualified to do that, simply because he was thinking that I will burn the coals after the time designated when it should have been burned. Is that enough to disqualify it? And what we're learning is that, they took it so seriously and they were so careful to have everything done properly that this question was enough to raise a doubt, and they weren't sure what the answer was. They weren't prepared to say, no, come on, that's too attenuated, we're going to let that go. They said, Teku, we don't know the answer to the question. New question. The sages raised a dilemma before Rav Sheshas. What is the law with regard to carrying the blood in one's left hand? So now we're back to the bull, and that or another animal offering that it's slaughtered. Some of its blood is collected in the sacred vessel that sanctifies the blood. Now it has to be conveyed to the altar. Can it be carried in the left hand? Normally, everything done in the temple that could be done with the right hand is done with the right hand. So if you do it with the left hand, does that disqualify the offering? Is this action valid? Or is carrying, like receiving and sprinkling the blood, an act that must be performed with the right hand? And Rav Shesha said to them, we already learned it. There is an answer to this question from the Mishna, our Mishna. He took the coal pan in his right hand and the ladle in his left hand. And this proves that although the ladle is carried in the left hand to the place of the service, the right is valid. Right? The incense, which is the more important thing of what the high priest is taking into the Holy of Holies, you would think it would go in his right hand and the coal pan would go in his left hand. But the coal pan is heavier than the incense ladle, and it's hot. And so just because sometimes the high priest was very old and not a particularly strong old man, they said you can carry, it's going to be normal to carry the coal pan in your right hand and the incense in your left. And that was just a practical consideration. It's not for any kind of spiritual reason. It's just the strength of the high priest. So since that's permissible, Rav Sheshis is saying, okay, we know that you can carry the important part of a ritual in the left hand. So if when a priest was bringing an animal offering and he received some of that, the lifeblood in the vessel, and then he carried it to the altar in his left hand, also it should not be disqualified. And the Gemara asks, and let us resolve this dilemma for them, the people who ask Rav Sheshes, from a different Mishnah, that the priest who is privileged to carry the head and the leg of the daily offering to the ramp carried the right leg in his left hand, with its entire hide facing outward, and the place of the slaughter on the neck facing the priest. And this Mishnah also proves that carrying with the left hand is acceptable. We saw that these daily offerings, there was the lottery of the priests, and it would take a group of them to carry the parts of the offering up to the altar. Okay, so one of the priests was carrying the head of the animal in his right hand and the leg in the left hand. So, okay, that was a piece of the animal that's being brought up to the altar in his left hand. It would seem that that answers the question. Why are we talking about the incense of Yom Kippur to answer a question about the blood of an animal when we have an answer from the limb of the animal? And the Gemara rejects this contention. I'm almost done now, so if you have any questions, get them in. The Gemara rejects this contention. If the proof is from there, I would have said that applies only to a type of carrying that does not invalidate atonement. As even if the limbs are not carried up to the altar, atonement is nevertheless achieved. Right? So when an animal offering is brought in the temple, let's say a burnt offering or sin offering, the burnt offering, all of the animals going to go up in smoke on the altar. The sin offering, most of the animals going to go up in smoke on the altar. That's the correct procedure. But what actually provides an atonement for the community in the case of a communal offering, or an individual in the case of an individual offering, is collecting that blood in the vessel and sprinkling it on the altar. That's what achieves atonement. So here they're saying, okay, well, let's not take a law about the limbs to give an answer about the blood, since the limbs don't provide atonement and the blood does. However, with regard to the type of carrying that does invalidate atonement, for example, carrying the blood to the altar, no, perhaps it must be done specifically with the right hand. And Rav Sheshes therefore teaches us from our Mishnah of the high priest on Yom Kippur, whose incense taken into the Holy of Holies does provide atonement, that even though you carry the article of that offering, in this case the incense, in the left hand, the service remains valid. And that's a better answer for this question of if the priest conveyed the blood of the animal offering in his left hand. That's the whole DAF. Congratulations, you did it. Hopefully the logic was followable. It was a fun page, difficult, but what's good about it is you can see how the sages draw from one set of laws to another set of laws to answer very specific questions. And you can see why Talmudic reasoning is so precise, so careful, so difficult, but that if you develop a head for it, it's just going to make you, very capable at handling any situation where you need to be able to distinguish between issues in order to arrive at the answers to difficult questions. Okay, let me see if you have questions for me tonight. Oh, I'm in the wrong document. Hold on. Here we go. Bill, I know it's probably not relevant, but the discussion of the coals suddenly brought to mind the passage from Isaiah where the angel of the Lord purifies the prophet's lips with coal from the altar. I'm familiar with the passage, but I don't have it at the tip of my tongue, so to speak, that I can comment on it. And then Tom answers, Moses put a coal in his mouth, leading to his speaking difficulty. That's in Midrash, right, where Pharaoh wanted to kill the young Moses because his astronomers said this kid is going to be problems for you. Like he's going to try to take over the kingdom. So they did a test, right? This is not in the Torah. This is in the Midrash. That, I guess what they put before him was gold, I think a gold crown or a hot coal. And if he went for the crown, they were going to kill him right then and there. And Moses reached for the crown, but an angel came and redirected Moses' hand to the hot coal, which has a little baby, like he grabbed and put it in his mouth and burned his lips. And that was a midrashic explanation for why Moses was a stutterer. It was difficult for him to speak, and he really never liked speaking in public. But think of the journey that Moses took as a private individual, that he really never wanted to speak in public. And by the end of his life, gave a month-long sermon, which is the book of Deuteronomy. Seraphim Winslow comments, what is it that regulates the thoughts of the priest? Is it just a matter of conscience such that it's up to the priest to confess he had a disqualifying thought? Definitely. I mean, no one can read other people's minds. But this is like one of many questions. I mean, I guess if we would hope that the priest would say, oh my gosh, you know what? I was confused. I was thinking that this was a sin offering, not a peace offering. And they have different deadlines and limitations. And I'm sorry, I messed it up, rather than just keep it to himself and not admit his error, but then bring a faulty offering on behalf either of the community or the individual who entrusted that offering to that priest. Definitely an honor system for the priest. But the other dimension of that question is it almost doesn't matter whether priests in real life spoke up or not. We hope they did. But that doesn't change the fact that we have a halachic question and the sages are going to probe the law to know, well, what would the answer be if that situation ever came up? And there's many situations that maybe would never come up in real life, but they're still going to probe and say, well, but what would the legal answer be? Because in conducting that analysis, what they're moving toward and why this Torah study is not just, pilpul is sometimes a word used as a derogatory term for Talmudic reasoning, I guess in the culture they make fun of the rabbis by saying, they're arguing about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. I don't think that actually is a question in the Talmud. It's just a question used to make fun of Talmudists. But the idea that we're parsing the law and the verses from the Bible in order to find out the answer to a question that may never come up in real life is that in making that probe, we're trying to understand what it is that God wants from us. Right? God gave us a Torah so that we would know how to live. So every time we ask a question and try to figure out what God's will would be for us in that situation, even if there's no chance it's going to come up in real life, we're coming closer to God's will. And so that is actually a way of coming closer to God. It's not that we say it's better to engage in Talmudic reasoning than in prayer or other kind of more directly spiritual practices like singing before the Lord, which if you joined us in our minyan, you'd see how much we love doing that. But it's just a different path, and a life of faith needs to be balanced, right? And so you would do all these different practices. You pray, and you sing, and you eat, and you rejoice, and you probe into the Torah to try to understand God's will, because our understanding is that the Torah is a piece of God. It's not just some ancient document. It's a living document that sort of carries God's will, and it's sort of a manifestation of God's self that's in this world. It's the greatest gift, in a sense, ever given into the physical universe is this expression of God's will that God told us, turn it over and over and over because everything, literally everything is in it. And the Torah itself, our sages teach, precedes the universe. The Torah existed before the universe. And the universe, the physical universe we inhabit, was created as a place where the Torah could be expressed in action and not just in the mind of God. Okay, that's what we've got tonight. May you be blessed with health, with joy, and a great new week. A good Vach, Shavua Tov. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night, the regular time, Sunday at 6 p.m. Pacific.